Hello and welcome to the latest episode of A Slice of Medieval podcast. Today we are going to do something slightly different, well, very different. It's Sharon and I, and we're going to talk about Sharon's new book, which is out very shortly, which is called Princesses of the Early Middle Ages, Royal Daughters of the Conquest. Now, this book covers an enormous period of time and has a very broad scope. And also, there's not very much evidence about it. So tell me, Sharon, why on earth did you take on writing this book?
Well, there were a couple of reasons, really. I keep seeing this meme on Facebook and Twitter and everything, and I'm sure you've seen it. My daughter asked me to treat her like a princess, so I married her to a stranger to cement a treaty with Poland or France or Portugal or Spain, whichever meme you've seen. Okay, so is that true? You know, that's the image we have of princesses in the Middle Ages. They were just married off to complete strangers for peace deals. So I thought maybe I should look at this and see how it is. And then I was using the fabulous 6-book series by Mary Ann Everett Green, The Lives of the Princesses of England.
Yeah, there should have been a clue there, but the fact that it was a 6-book series should have given you a bit of a clue, I think, about the size of the topic.
Yeah. But her series goes from William the Conqueror's daughters all the way up to the 20th century. And I was just doing the Middle Ages. So, you know, it did actually turn out to be too long. The book was about 150,000 words, which is why we now have 2 books, Princesses of the Early Middle Ages and Princesses of the Later Middle Ages. And the Later Middle Ages will be out at the end of August. So Princesses of the Early Middle Ages, I stopped after the daughters of King John. So it only goes from 1066 to the mid-1200s.
So just a mere couple of 100 years then.
Yeah. But that was the reason to actually do a modern version of Mary Ann Everett Green's, because that's a rather old book. But it's a fabulous series, and I've been using it an awful lot in my own research, mainly to get references. She did some fabulous research for the book, and I thought I just want to do an updated version and do it based on the views we have today as well, you know, because a lot of books, even written by women in the past, have not necessarily been misogynistic, but the attitude to history in those days was male orientated. So there are different views, you know, and you see how girls who might have stood up to their dads for certain reasons are given certain labels, you know, like with the she-wolf label and that. Women who are strong and independent and who assert their independence are often criticised even by other women because we didn't have that attitude to women before. So it's like just looking at them through a modern focus and not giving them modern intentions or anything, but just avoiding the labels.
I mean, we should, I suppose, say that the traditional view of princesses is obviously informed by the traditional view of the role of women. So you can't sort of separate those things. You can separate them in that princesses had a different status and a different role, but within that, they were also part of attitudes towards the role of women. So there's that aspect to it. And I think it's a very necessary piece of history. What you've produced is a very, very, very necessary piece of history to update and give modern context, really, to the role of princess, because there are loads of them.
Yeah.
as I'm sure you know.
And we have this attitude that, yes, they were, they were raised in a gilded cage, they were dressed in jewels, but they had no purpose other than to give birth to the heir to the throne of whichever country they married into. The attitude that they were just ornamentation.
Yeah, or pieces on a board. They were just chess pieces.
And the idea is they had no power and they had no influence, and they weren't there to be anything other than decorative. And it's like, when you look into it, the role of a princess was far, far more involved. They were literally the peace weavers, they were the physical link of a peace treaty. Parents took care in organizing their futures. So that was the reason behind writing the book, that there are so many misconceptions involved in what a medieval
Yeah.
princess was and what her duties were, basically. And I wanted to address that.
One of the things we've come across quite a few times is the idea, not just in terms of women, but people generally. When we look back to somewhere as long ago as the Middle Ages, there's a tendency to actually forget they're human beings,
Mm.
and to forget that their motives had a personal angle, had a human angle that we sort of avoid at our peril, or we ignore at our peril. So, yeah, I agree. It's a subject that needs to be examined again, and I think what you've done is kind of sort of drawn the blinds and let the light in a bit on something which has just been an assumption, hasn't there, of
Mm.
this traditional role. Now, okay, we said it's a really big topic, obviously a big landscape to cover. So, as Baldrick would say, how did the war start? But how did you decide where to start with this great task?
Well, I originally started, literally, it's called Royal Daughters of the Conquest. So I thought, right, we'll start with William the Conqueror. And then, of
Yeah,
course, like I say, the book was too long, so I had to split it in two. And then suddenly I had about another 5,000 or 6,000 words to use with the first book. So I thought, actually, I started with William the Conqueror's daughters because that's where Mary and Everett Green started. But there were two other princesses in 1066, and they don't get a
mm.
lot of coverage. So I thought, you know what? I'm going to start with Harold II's daughters. And I'm really glad I did, because Githa and Gunhild had two very different lives to
Yeah,
each other. And one was in a convent at the time of the conquest, probably there to be educated and then to be safe from being kidnapped by Norman. And the other one escaped to Europe and ended up in Eastern Europe and
yeah.
actually married the future Grand Prince of Kiev and Rus.
To be honest, hand on heart, never heard of either of them really, and their stories, as you say, are very different. And I found it was one of my favourite bits of the book actually was reading about those two, because maybe because I didn't really have any clue. I barely knew they existed really. And to then find out, as you say,
Yeah.
that one of them ended up in Eastern Europe in quite a prominent position
Mm-hmm.
was a bit of an eye opener, really.
Yeah, and I mean, I was aware Gunhild, the one who stayed in England, I always thought she was quite interesting because she married a chap named Alan Roof. Well, married in the loosest sense of the word. No one's quite sure whether she married him or was his concubine. Alan Rufus, who was the son of the Count of Brittany. And then when he died, she married his brother, Alan Niger. So it's like, okay, two brothers, both named Alan. One's Alan the
I
Red
know.
and one's Alan the Black.
But they used to do that with names. I mean, common people would also be distinguished in that because of the commonplace nature of certain names. They everybody used to distinguish them
Yeah.
somehow.
The reason I got into her story, and it was a while ago now, was her grandson is buried in Lincoln Cathedral. And they don't know where he's buried in Lincoln Cathedral, but they have still got the burial plate that used to mark his grave. And it's like, so the great grandson of King Harold is buried in Lincoln Cathedral.
Yeah.
It was just such a close link to where I live. And I started looking into it, and it's like he was fostered into William II's household, and he died when he was about 8 years old, and buried in Lincoln. And Gunhild's mother, Edith Swanneck, she had lands in East Anglia.
Mm.
And it seems that Alan Niger either kidnapped or formed a relationship with Gunhild because he'd been given Edith Swanneck's lands and thought that he would strengthen his claim to them by being with Gunhild. So it was like interesting to look at the local history as well as the history of this girl who, she wasn't born a princess because her dad didn't become king until 1066, but for 10 months in 1066 she was a princess.
Mm.
And it's just interesting, like I say, she stayed local, stayed in England, and Githa left with her grandmother, also called Githa,
Yeah.
and ended up in Eastern Europe. You know, she is the ancestress of the current king. You know, her lineage came back into the royal family through Philippa of Hainault, I think it was.
Philippa, yeah, that was another interesting thing that came up, which I didn't know. I mean, I suppose there are, in fact, billions of things I don't know, so it's not that surprising that some of them came up in this book. But yeah, I mean, and then obviously you dealt with those two, Githa and Gunhild, and I thought that was, as I say, a good start because it was really interesting. And then, of course, you got the daughters of William the Conqueror. You know, he's not exactly a shrinking violet, is he? So that was interesting because again, all the focus is on the men, isn't it? Whenever anybody's talking about the Norman conquest and his sons, it's about William Rufus, it's about the elder
Yeah.
one, Robert of Normandy, it's about Henry, who becomes Henry the First. It's never very often about his daughters, and if it is, the only daughter that's mentioned is Adela,
Yes, definitely.
because
Well,
she has a link with the future and was quite powerful. Actually, she's one of my favorites in the book, I must admit. I quite like her.
she is a personal favorite of mine because Adela is one of those where she gets a bad press because she was married to Stephen of Blois, the father of King Stephen. And
Yeah,
Stephen of Blois went on crusade, on the first crusade in 1096,
yeah,
vowed to free Jerusalem, um, you know, real crusaders' vows. He fell ill, and when he recovered, he was on his way to return to the crusade. Well, I think it was the Siege of Acre. He got there, he saw that the crusading army that was besieging Acre was being besieged themselves, and he was convinced that they'd be defeated. So he decided he wasn't worth dying over and turned away and met another army coming to the rescue of the Crusaders and told them it's all lost, they're defeated. Took ship back to France. By the time he got back to France, the Crusaders had won. And he'd basically run away from the crusade.
not a good look, is it really?
No, he was a deserter. He failed to fulfill his crusading vows. You know, he was damned to hell, basically,
Yeah,
as far as
yeah.
anyone was concerned. He had done the worst thing he could. Supposedly, his wife Adela shamed him into returning to the crusade to literally fulfill his vows and complete his crusade. And then he dies at the Battle of Ramla. And Adela's blamed for shaming her husband to go back so badly that he has to go back to his death.
But when you say blamed at the time or blamed by historians since, or both?
I don't think, not necessarily, it was commented on at the time that she had told him that he should go back. But it's since, I think it was Sharon Penman's when Christ and his saints slept. She blames Adela.
Mm.
It's Adela's fault that Stephen died in the Holy Land because she was the one who shamed him so much that he had to go back. Yeah, but you're looking at it through today's eyes.
Yeah, yeah.
She was concerned for his immortal soul. He had failed in his Crusader vows. If he didn't go back, he was going to hell.
That surely would have been the view at the time.
I doubt it was her on her own.
Yeah.
She probably knew that
Yeah.
he would have wanted to go back as well once he'd found out that he'd actually made this huge mistake. He was a pariah. He'd have to rectify it. But she gets the blame that he goes back and he dies. But as far as
Yeah.
everybody at that time would have been concerned, he had
Yeah.
a noble death. He was a knight who fulfilled his Crusader vows. He returned and he died in the attempt to recover Jerusalem. So
Yeah.
there was no shame for him in doing that. The shame would have been him staying in Blois when he'd basically been accused of being a coward.
I think you're right to mention again this whole business of his immortal soul and so on, because so often today people ascribe the wrong motives to someone's actions because they ignore the strong sense of what life was in medieval times. Life was
Yes.
preparation for death, if you like, preparation for the afterlife. And, people looked at it in a completely different way
Yes.
from the way that we would look at life, or most of us would look at life now, and the meaning of life and so on. So
death was just
yeah,
part of the journey of
yeah,
life's journey. The main part of life was actually after death. Fulfilling his Crusader vows meant he was guaranteed a place in heaven.
yeah, yeah. So yeah, I and she had quite a bit of influence, didn't she, Adela?
She did. Well, that's the other thing about her. She was an incredibly, and this is another thing that you think that people say, that girls weren't educated. Adela was an incredibly well-educated woman. In her husband's absence, she ruled the counties of Blois and Chartres, first when he was away on crusade, and then after he died as regent for her young son. She corresponded with great churchmen. She was a friend of Anselm, the Archbishop of Canterbury. When Anselm had an argument with Henry I, he went and stayed with Adela, and then she was the one who brokered the peace between Henry and Anselm so that Anselm could return to England. She was an incredibly influential, incredibly well-educated, and very intelligent woman.
Yeah, and we do these women a grave disservice by forgetting that, really.
Yes, we do. And that is the thing that got me when I was writing this book. These girls were not sent out into the world unprepared and, told, right, your job is to go and have children and that's it. They were sent out into the world as bridges between England and whoever they married. And as their main job after being a mother was a diplomat. They were the first permanent ambassadors to different countries.
Yeah. So you then you include a whole chapter on Henry I's illegitimate daughters. I'm not surprised because I know that Henry had a lot of illegitimate children, and there's a good chance that a lot of them were female. So I'm not surprised. But what did you find? What did you find from that, from researching that?
Well, I included them. At first I was like, oh no, I don't have to include these illegitimate daughters. And then I thought about Juliana of Fontevraud, the one who fired a crossbow at her dad. And I'm there thinking, I can't leave her out, can I? And then there's Sibylla of Normandy, who married Alexander I of Scotland. So one of his illegitimate daughters actually became a queen. And it's like, so why did he have so many illegitimate children, and particularly illegitimate daughters? Most kings, I'm thinking of Henry VIII here, wouldn't recognize an illegitimate daughter because they didn't think they were worth anything. you know, so we have this thing over Catherine Carey, whether or not she was Henry VIII's daughter, because he didn't recognise her if she was, because daughters are worthless. And it's like, Henry I used his illegitimate daughters. He had a plan, and it was wonderful. He recognised all of his illegitimate children, and he used them to bind people to the English crown, to make allies of people. When you actually look at it, he basically surrounds France. You know, he marries his daughter, his legitimate daughter, to Germany. He marries an illegitimate daughter to Brittany, another one to Breteuil, to all these areas in France, the counties in France, in order to protect his borders. Yeah, and he's strengthening all his borders with his illegitimate daughters, and he's binding these people to the English crown as friends and allies. But the one thing he is not doing is he is not passing on a claim to the throne.
Yeah.
They have no claim on the throne itself, just on the familial affection of their wife's father. And it works really well.
So, I mean, Henry I's illegitimate daughters, there were a lot of them. There were a lot of illegitimate sons as well. And we won't go into all of that because we've discussed that many times and quite recently on Henry I.
And yeah, the last episode we just did was Henry I. So if anyone's interested in hearing more,
so
go back to last episode, episode
we'll
89.
We'll draw a veil over that. So let's focus a bit on the purpose of the book, in a sense, about the role of the princess, both in her family and in the wider world. Now, you started off by saying the traditional idea of a princess is that they were only there to be married off and forgotten about. So what's the reality of it in terms of the role of a princess?
Well, the reality is, yes, they were more often than not married off, although William the Conqueror's daughters, about 3 of them actually joined convents rather than marrying. But they weren't left to their own devices after being married off. You know, it wasn't go off and marry so-and-so, we don't want to hear or see you again. The whole idea of marrying them off was to make that link with this foreign country. So with Empress Matilda being married into Germany, there's letters constantly between Henry V and Henry I during the marriage, and you know, they arranged to meet and they plan campaigns against France together. And it's same with Henry II, you know, his daughters. Joanna married William of Sicily, and Matilda, she married Henry the Lion, Duke of Saxony, and then Leonor married the King of Castile. Those marriages were strategic marriages in order to have closer links with those countries. And when things went bad for them, like Matilda, as Duchess of Saxony, her husband had a really bad relationship with the emperor. He was basically too strong, too good a soldier, and too big a threat. So he got exiled from Germany at one stage, and the entire family came, except for one son who stayed in Germany, possibly as a hostage. The rest of the family came back to England and Normandy to stay with Henry II. And some of her children were even born in England and left in England when she returned to Germany to be raised by their grandfather. And you look at where these girls were married into, you know, there's Scotland, Wales, Spain, Brittany,
Anjou, everywhere really. Lots of European places.
Yeah, but never France.
No.
There's no English princess married a future King of France or King of France until Mary Tudor in the Henry VIII sister. It wasn't, it was like to surround France
Yeah,
with, they'd marry into Toulouse, Brittany, but
yeah,
not the kingdom itself. And the furthest anyone went was Githa into Kievan Rus, because she wasn't at that time a daughter of a king of England.
yeah.
So it's like when you look at the daughters of the kings of England, it's like they're not married off too far away. It's people whose alliances they actually need and are going to be useful to them.
Surely the thrust of that for hundreds of years is caused by William the Conqueror coming over as Duke of Normandy and coming over and basically forging this European unit of England,
Mm,
Normandy, and one or two other bits and pieces later on with the Angevins. But so it that changed England's focus diplomatically. So France
yes.
was then hostile potentially because it bordered Normandy and it no doubt coveted Normandy. Whereas when
Yeah.
the Anglo-Saxon kings were ruling, Edward the Confessor and so on, France was just one of a number of European states, Normandy included, with which he had
Mm,
relations. And there wasn't that same
yeah.
approach, that same fear.
And you will see in my second book, in the later Middle Ages, that are more associated with their England's trading partners.
Yeah,
So the
yeah,
focus on who to marry these girls to changed based on England's needs and the fact that England was no longer the Angevin Empire. So in later times, it was more on England's needs rather than the empire's needs. Whereas
yeah,
at the time, in the early time with William the Conqueror, it was England and Normandy's needs. And then with the Angevins, you've got Aquitaine, all the way from Aquitaine to the Scottish border, they've got to consider.
yeah. What struck me is that all that you've said so far, plus obviously the contents of the book itself, really give the lie to this traditional idea. Because, I mean, the whole idea, the meme you mentioned at the start, the whole idea of that is ludicrous because the point of the marriage was to establish contact. So if they're then forgotten
Yes.
about, that rather defeats the object, really, of
Yeah.
building bridges and so on. I mean, you don't build a bridge and then not go across it.
No, exactly.
So the whole point was to make connections which otherwise wouldn't exist.
Yeah, and it's a physical and permanent connection.
Yeah,
And I mean, I did read one day, it said, these girls are then, they're married off to somebody for a peace treaty that might only last 5 years, and then suddenly they're out in the wilderness because they're at war with their fathers. And it's like, actually, that very, very rarely happened.
yeah,
Edward the Third's sister married the King of Scots, and then Edward the Third made war on Scotland. That's the main one, the one that I always think of. But in the early Middle Ages, these peace treaties, where they involved a marriage, the whole idea was to make it permanent,
yeah.
to cement the relationship. So they weren't actually offered as brides in a peace treaty that wasn't intended to last very long. It was in the ones that were intended to cement a relationship and build on it.
What's quite clear from the book is that there's a massive contrast in the fates, the roles, and the marriages and the outcomes of these princesses' roles. So the fact that one or two were perhaps out on a limb
Mm,
is usually down to the circumstances in the country itself rather than neglect by the parents or whatever who've set this up.
yes.
Yeah, that's what I got out of it anyway.
Yeah, I mean, changing political situations and could cause problems for them. What amazed me was I thought, they never had contact with family again. Yes, they had diplomatic relations, but no relations, with a brother or a sister. And then you find out, Joanna was sent to Sicily.
Henry II's daughter, Joanna. Yeah,
Yeah, and she probably thought she'd never see any family members again. She's out there on a limb on her own in Sicily. Then you then you
Yeah,
find out Sicily's one of the stopping points on the journey to
yeah,
the Crusades.
yeah,
So who turns up but Big Brother Richard? And then, of course, her husband's died, so Big Brother Richard takes her with him and tries to marry her off to
yeah,
Saladin's brother. Whether or not he was serious, we
yes,
did an
yeah,
episode with Catherine Hanley, didn't we, about Joanna? And the suggestion is Richard actually did it because he knew Joanna would totally refuse. He knew it was totally unfeasible, but it was a way of diplomatically suggesting a way forward. But yeah, even then she's out there in Sicily, but she still gets to see her big brother.
yeah. I mean, it struck me that there are two things that people often forget about how these arrangements sometimes turned out. One is that all families have different sorts of relationships between children and parents and between the children themselves.
Mm,
That's just a constant of human activity. So in some cases, a daughter might be married off to somebody, and because that daughter was never really that close to her parents, or maybe was married or betrothed so young that she didn't spend a lot of time with her parents, maybe the link isn't as strong there as with some other daughters that were married.
mm,
So that sort of family relationship, in personal relationship aspect, is often ignored.
yeah,
But the second thing, which is very important, I think, is the risk of illness, and in particular the risks of childbirth. So the outcomes of these marriages could be adversely affected by the woman just becoming ill or difficulties of childbirth,
yeah.
which were again factors of the time.
Well, and actually, and the other one is actually not having a child.
Yeah,
King John's daughter Joan was married to the King of Scots, Alexander II, and she never had a child. And so it's like, well, what was the point of that marriage then? It's a failed marriage because she didn't have a child. But then you see that in her relationship, the one
mm,
thing about King John's children, I mean, you've got this bad King John and Isabella of Angoulême, his wife, who bogs off back to France once John's dead and marries actually Joan's fiance. They haven't got the best example of parents of King John's children. And you've got Henry III, Richard, Earl of Cornwall, and then three daughters, Joan, Isabella, and Eleanor. And you look at these siblings, and except for the fact that Eleanor decides to marry Simon de Montfort and joins the rebels against her brother, the siblings have a really close
yeah,
relationship. They didn't grow up together, they grew up in separate households,
yeah,
but they have
yeah,
this really
yeah,
close relationship. Isabella is married to the Holy Roman Emperor, and both her brother Richard and her sister Eleanor actually visit her when she's staying in Italy because it's on the way to the Crusades. And
yeah,
Eleanor actually stays in Italy while Simon's on crusade. So you can bet that the sisters spent a good bit of time together then.
yeah,
And Joan actually uses her personal letters
yeah,
to Henry III to stave off a war between Scotland and England. When the relationship gets a bit fraught and Henry's threatening, she is the one using her personal letters saying Alexander actually says this, let's keep it friendly.
yeah,
And she actually dies in her brother's arms when she dies in
yeah,
England. And Henry III and their brother Richard are both there when she dies. And it's just remarkable to me that you've got this,
mm,
they've always known that they're going to be raised, to be sent abroad, to live somewhere else, but they can keep this sibling relationship together and, communicate between each other. And they keep their countries from war because they're brother and sister and trust each other.
yeah. It always seems to me to be an assumption that, that these princesses are discarded, but
Mm,
it seems to me that their role is just as difficult, but also could be just as rewarding
yeah.
as their brothers who perhaps have to fight wars or do other things which aren't necessarily that pleasant. But again, they have the possibility of gaining power through that. But the daughters too, some of
Mm,
them are very powerful women. And so the opportunity is there. And I think also what annoys me a bit is this whole myth that, people didn't travel. So, I mean, they're not marrying somebody on the planet Jupiter. I mean, there were established trade and travel routes across
Yeah.
Europe. And whilst travel may have been slow and difficult at times, I mean, the evidence shows us that it wasn't that
No.
difficult for somebody who had wealth to travel wherever they wanted in Western Europe.
And if they can't travel in person, they can send messages. There's
Yeah,
messengers going backwards and
yeah,
forwards all the time.
yeah,
Diplomatic pouches, and you can send a gift. They still
yeah,
remember Christmas, sent gifts for Christmas and for birthdays and things and saints' days to their siblings or daughters or sons, wherever they were.
yeah,
You look at it as a network of family links
yeah,
throughout Europe.
yeah.
It gives a whole different meaning to what a princess's job was. People talk about duty, but it was a job. They were raised
Yeah.
from the earliest times. They didn't know where they were going to live, but they knew what their duties were going to be. They were going to be the link between their father and then their brother and maybe their nephew, depending on the generations.
It was a chance to be influencers, really, in the medieval world.
Yeah.
Now, I wanted to ask you one other thing in that whole the issue of the role of princesses, because several times already we've mentioned princesses going to convents, going to nunneries,
Mm.
and so on. So, is it fair to ask whether those daughters were being discarded, or is there another way of looking at that?
There was always an attitude in medieval times that possibly at least one daughter may join a convent so that she could perform service to God and her family, in that there is somebody praying for the entire family who's got this closer link with God because they're in a convent. William the Conqueror, one of his daughters, Cecilia, was put in a convent when she was 7 or 8, and so she was always destined for the church. Others found the church later on. Another daughter, Adelaide, she had so many marriage proposals go wrong that she decided to just I think some of it was like, oh, stuff it, I'm going in a convent and that's that.
Yeah, I think modern people can understand that some people might decide in adult life to go into a convent,
Mm,
and it was a good move from their point of view for various reasons. I think it's the ones who are there from an early age or whatever who sometimes are regarded as being discarded. But I think you've explained, and again, we mentioned it earlier, the whole religious angle of life, the
yes.
religious aspect of life. So they were fulfilling a role for the family and
Mm,
themselves in being sent to a convent. I guess
yeah.
the modern view about all these things is they didn't have any say in the matter, but then who did? You know?
Yeah, even sons didn't have a say in what their life was going to be.
No, that's my point.
William the Conqueror
Yeah,
decided who was going to be King of England and
yeah,
who was going to be
yeah,
Duke of Normandy in his sons. So he decided what was going to happen with his
yeah.
daughters as well. And just the same as, one sent into a convent and the other is sent to Sicily or wherever to be married. It's just that is what families did. The parents decided their futures. Being sent into a convent wasn't being discarded.
No,
They still had communication with each other, families still visited
yeah.
and sent gifts, and it was a career.
And of course, one or two would be groomed, if that's the right word for a woman, but groomed to be abbesses and so on.
Yeah, that's the thing. It was a career just as much as being married.
Cecilia became an abbess, didn't she?
Cecilia became an abbess, yeah.
Yeah,
And abbesses were powerful women,
yeah,
They didn't just rule
yeah.
communities, they communicated with the popes, the bishops, they had controlled land property as well as the nuns under in their charge. It was a huge responsibility and a great career move.
I think it's worth saying that, and we haven't sort of said at the beginning you were talking about Githa and Gunhild, who are obviously Saxon princesses, but there is continuity. We're not talking about what Normans wanted to do with their daughters. We're talking about what kings
Yes.
over time wanted to do. This is something that daughters of kings that was their job,
Yes.
as you said. So whether they're Norman or Saxon or Danish or anything, or French for that matter, the same rules apply.
Yes,
and
definitely.
it's what the world was like
Yeah.
in that time. And it kind of devalues their role to regard them as being sort of thrown away, discarded, not regarded as very important. But also the other thing, of course, and you'd have found this in your research, is that they are so infrequently mentioned in the chronicles written by men.
Yeah, it's
that it's hard
infuriating.
to get a sense of their personality at times, or even exactly when they were born or died,
or even
because
their
they're just not.
names.
Yeah, or even their names, because they're not central to what's recorded.
No, and you've got one chronicler giving you, with William the Conqueror, giving you a list of 5 daughters with different names, and then another chronicler giving you 5 other daughters with, there's an Agatha who might have been a daughter of William the Conqueror, but we're not quite sure because it's only Audric Vitalis who mentions her. There's a Matilda who he doesn't mention, but she is his daughter because she's in another record where she's got Matilda, the king's daughter, has a seneschal who's doing something. Then, of course, there's Gundrada de Warren, the wife of William de Warren, the first Earl Warren, who's in the book because she isn't a daughter of William the Conqueror, but for 800 years it was believed she was, because some monk copied down the foundation charter of Lewes Priory, writing and put in that she was William the Conqueror's daughter when she wasn't.
He was just adding a bit of colour.
So it was just, I put her in because it was just to actually demonstrate the difficulties in identifying some of these women, because like you say, they weren't the focus of the chroniclers, because of course all the chroniclers want to talk about is the deeds of men.
Well, also the deeds of the church, let's be fair. And so if you were a princess married to the King of Sicily or whatever, then you were not in the forefront of that English chronicler's mind when he was recording what was important. Didn't mean that what you were doing wasn't important. It just meant it wasn't important to him.
Well, it's that other saying, isn't it? Well-behaved women rarely make history, because, of course, the only ones who are written down in the chroniclers are the ones who are used as an example of what not to be as a woman. They spoke out. How dare they?
Yes, the weakness of women.
Yeah.
Eve's got a lot to be responsible for.
She gets the blame for everything, poor woman.
Absolutely.
All she did was try and feed a bloke, give him an apple, and it's like, oh God.
Yeah, let's not go into that. So do you have a favourite princess in all of these? God knows how many of them. Have you got a favourite one?
I think it is Henry II's daughter, Joanna.
Yeah.
She's certainly the most well-travelled of princesses. She was married into Sicily, went on crusade with her brother, then married Raymond of Toulouse. I just find her fascinating because she is actually the prime example of what these princesses were raised to be. She was raised to be the queen of the King of Sicily and educated to that role, but then life threw her a curveball. She didn't have any children with him, and she ended up being arrested and imprisoned by his successor to be freed by her brother, who was on his way to crusade. Said, well, you might as well come with me. And then he tries to use her as to form peace with Saladin, and she's like, it's not happening. Even though Saladin's brother actually did agree to convert to Christianity, she was still having none of it. So it shows that she did have the strength and the opportunity to stand up for things that she definitely didn't believe in.
Yeah.
And then she comes back to Europe and marries Raymond of Toulouse to help settle an issue with Toulouse, actually, because Aquitaine, which was owned by Richard's mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, claimed sovereignty over Toulouse.
Yeah.
So the agreement was that Joanna married Raymond of Toulouse, and then the sovereignty issue isn't an issue anymore because it's brought into the Angevin family. She's the prime example of what the princess's duty was, of how their lives could change very drastically and dramatically.
But also how they weren't entirely pawns in the hands of their family.
No,
They had
exactly.
sometimes a say in what was going on. But I mean, it's hardly surprising you've picked her out, given her parents and her family. I mean, they are the kind of
Yeah,
the archetypal medieval powerhouse of English history, aren't they? Henry II, Eleanor of Aquitaine,
they are. They really are.
and Richard Lionheart. You know that John.
Yeah.
What a family!
But the thing is, the girls are just as strong and
Yeah,
influential
yeah,
as the boys, because there's Joanna, as I've said, and then there's her sister
yeah,
Matilda, who acted as regent in Saxony. Henry the Lion was exiled a
yeah,
second time, and Matilda stayed in Saxony that time to act as regent because she'd had all her children and she could act as regent. And then there's Leonor, who was married into Castile,
yeah.
who had probably one of the greatest love stories of medieval history because she and her husband were so close and had
Mm,
such a fabulous relationship when you don't usually see that in
mm,
royal marriages.
yeah,
But they only
yeah.
died a month apart, and it was like their relationship was so lovely. And she got to see her mum again before Eleanor died, because Eleanor of Aquitaine went to Spain to pick one of Leonor's daughters to marry the son of the King of France. And
As you
so,
do.
yeah, but it's that idea that all three of these two daughters, as women, got to see their mother again.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, they weren't sent off and isolated. They were still part of the family. And I
Mm,
think that's what doesn't get across a great
yeah.
deal when people talk
Yeah.
about princesses, that they are still part of their birth family. And that is the whole point of these marriages.
So, uh, so your favorite is Joanna, and if anybody wants to find out more about Joanna, we did do a podcast on Joanna last year sometime, I think,
Yeah, with Catherine Hanley. That was
with
brilliant.
Catherine Hanley, the wonderful Catherine Hanley. So, if you want to look that up, I've no idea what number it was, but it's about Joanna, so you'll find
Yes.
it easily enough. So, okay, so she's your favorite. I've already said Adela is my favorite. Who's your least favorite? Have you got a least favorite?
Only because I don't like her husband.
Well, that's a bit unfair.
I know, but she supported her husband, and it's Eleanor,
Which one? There are a lot of Eleanors, not as many as there are Matildas.
Countess of Pembroke and Leicester, daughter of King John and wife of Simon de Montfort.
Right, okay.
And it's
Um,
because I don't like Simon de Montfort. I'm not a fan of Simon de Montfort.
mind you, she had quite a rough deal though, didn't she?
It's the fact that she supported Simon de Montfort over her brother that I don't like.
Yeah, but he was
But
her
she,
husband.
but she led an absolutely fascinating life. She was married very young. She was about 8 or 9 when she was married to William II Marshall. So she became Countess of Pembroke by marrying William Marshall, and he died when she was 15 or 16.
Well, he was about 103, wasn't he? So,
Yeah. And I always think of her as this, like, oh God, teenage lost love, because she swears a vow of eternal chastity. I'm never going to love again once William dies. And then, of course, she meets Simon de Montfort and goes, oh, bugger. I didn't mean it.
yeah, I mean, come on, teenagers. You don't expect them to keep what they say in that when they're
I didn't
teenagers, do
mean
you?
it.
Quite right too. They can change their minds. Yeah. Okay, so you don't like her because
Not that I don't like her.
you don't like her because she was loyal to her husband, who happened to be a traitor.
I like her. I don't like her husband. So I like Eleanor, but I don't like her husband.
How well do you know her husband?
I just think of
I
him
mean,
as a sanctimonious prig. So
harsh words. Okay, fair enough. Let's not go on to Simon de Montfort. We've done him a couple of times, so let's leave him
yeah,
alone for a minute. Right. Well, it's as I said at the start, it's a very necessary piece of history that you've produced there, and I'm looking forward to the next bit, the second half, when you look at the later medieval period, and there's certainly some cracking stories there.
Yeah, I'm just editing that
Yeah,
now. I'm on to Edward the Third's daughters at the minute. I really enjoyed doing that one as well, and Edward the Fourth's daughters. I'm looking forward to editing that bit.
that could be. There's a lot of them. So yeah, that'll be interesting. So are you working on anything else at the moment?
My current project is medieval rebel women. Not mad, sometimes bad and dangerous to know.
Another short title.
Yeah. I'm going to have to stop with the subtitles. It's annoying. But yeah.
So is there ever going to be a point where you run out of medieval women to talk about, or are you going to
I,
focus in perhaps on one of them?
well, I don't know. I might. The one after the medieval rebel women is going to be educating medieval women. So
Oh,
that's going
right.
to be
Okay.
more of a general rather than
Yeah.
I'll be looking at some specific women, but just at the role of education in women and pointing out that women were educated. They weren't sent out into the world absolute ignorant idiots
Well,
like
some of them were.
people seem to say. Yeah, but that's the same today as well, isn't
I
it?
don't
Men
know.
and women alike.
I think that's a discussion for a later time.
Some people just can't be educated.
Anyway, thanks for that. And this book is out
Yes.
very, very shortly, if I remember rightly. It's out in a few days.
Yep, 30th of March it's out, so not long now. And yeah,
Yeah, and I can thoroughly recommend it to everybody because I've read
thank
it.
you.
It's one of those things where, like some of your other books, but probably more so than some of your other books, you can dip into it and you can have a look at a chapter because the sections are quite large. So you've got that
Mm,
one family bit or whatever covered,
yes.
and then they can leave it and another time come back to a later bit because there's a lot to digest.
Mm,
But I quite like that about it, that you can dip into it.
yeah, and it's one family at a time. So you've got the daughters of King
Yeah,
John and the
yeah.
daughters of Henry II. So you can look into one family at a time. But it's also, they're not looked at in isolation. I tell the story of their fathers and brothers around them as well, so that you can see that they're not just individual separate parts.
And I love the family trees at the beginning, which is a warning to anybody reading the book because there are a lot of women on those. But I like the bit where it just says you've got the names of the princesses, and then somewhere on the left it says an arrow which says sons.
Sons, which makes a change.
Yeah,
Yeah, which makes a change because if you look at a lot of family trees, it's just all the boys and then daughters. So
totally male centered usually. Yeah, that was quite interesting and refreshing.
it was interesting building those family trees actually
Yeah, I
because
bet
you're
it
so
was.
used to doing it based on the men, and you're sort of like, well, it's based on the men because you've got to have the kings there because it's their daughters, but then you're
Yeah,
not going through, so you're keeping one son, i.e. the one that's the next king, but then
yeah.
it's the daughters you need to list. And
It's a totally different perspective and a refreshing one, I think.
mm,
Okay, so thanks, Sharon, for going through all that with us, and I hope that people will rush out and buy the book in a few days' time, or have it on pre-order, even better.
yes, you can still pre-order it. Thank you, Derek, that's been great fun. Yeah, it's been funny actually not being the one to do all the introduction and things, but I'm going to do the closing bit. Do join us next time when we will be joined by Michael Jex and discussing the First Crusade, which I'm really looking forward to because the Third Crusade gets a lot of coverage, but the First Crusade often gets ignored and overlooked. So I've got a list of questions ready for Michael. There's a
Excellent.
warning for him. Thank you very much for listening. I'm Sharon Bennett Connolly.
And I'm Derek Birks. Thanks for joining us today. Sharon's book is certainly well worth reading, and I enjoyed it. Remember to subscribe if you're enjoying our podcasts, whether it be on YouTube or on your favorite podcast provider. Thanks again.